Okay, hi everyone, and you're very welcome to our first CSHHH summer school webinar on the theme of mental health. So we're delighted to have Dr. Hannah Proctor here today and Professor Matt Smith, who are going to be talking about this theme and their research. So just to let you know that while Matt and Hannah are speaking, you can submit questions through the Q&A button, which should be at the bottom of your screen, or alternatively through the chat button. And then we can have the questions loaded up to ask Matt and Hannah after their talks. So this webinar is part of a series of events that's taking place over the next few weeks, and you can sign up for the other events on Eventbrite. Our next seminar is next Thursday at the same time, and we're really looking forward to having Dr. Tichi Huang and Dr. Kay Nias, who are going to be talking about cultures of well-being and their work on this area. So please do tune in again next week. So I'll just introduce Matt and Hannah and then we'll get started. Professor Matt Smith is Professor of Health History at the CSHHH, and he's currently Vice Dean for Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Strathclyde. His research looks at the history of mental health and psychiatry and has explored ADHD in children, the relationship between food and mental health, social psychiatry and the prevention of mental illness, and most recently he's done some work on sport and mental health. He's also co-editor with Kathy Colburn of the Palgrave series Mental Health in Historical Perspective, which has published 20 monographs and edited volumes since 2015. Dr. Hannah Proctor is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow at Strathclyde as well. Her project called War Mentalities, Mental Health, Migration, Cultural Exchange, and the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System explores attempts by American psychiatrists to comprehend the Soviet mind at a moment when tensions between the US and the USSR were increasing. Her monograph, Psychologies in Revolution, Alexander Luria's Romantic Science and Soviet Social History, was published recently by Palgrave in the Mental Health and Historical Perspective series I just mentioned. And she serves on the editorial collective of Radical Philosophy and is also web editor of the History of Human Sciences. So thank you, Matt and Hannah, for joining us today. And we're going to start off with Matt's presentation, and then we'll have Hannah's follow on from that, and then take some questions. So go ahead, Matt. Thanks whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in, and many thanks to Laura for organizing this. It's a great initiative. It's something that we probably should have done years ago, and I think the pandemic has perhaps spurred Laura into action a wee bit in this respect. So I hope that we can continue to do these sorts of things in CSHHH in non-pandemic years as well. So what I'll be talking about this afternoon is mainly some general reflections about the history of psychiatry and mental illness and mental health, why I think it's important, and some of the insights perhaps that I've gained over the years. You can take or leave them, but I would like to think that some of them at least perhaps give us some kind of an idea of why we should be doing more research in mental health and psychiatry, even though already it's a very popular field for both students and academics. So I'm going to start by explaining a little bit before I share my screen, if anyone's wondering why I haven't done that yet, a little bit about how I got into this topic. I was working in the late 90s in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada at the YMCA as a youth counselor, helping kids that were in often quite difficult circumstances, living on the streets, coming in and out of prison, and dealing with addictions and all sorts of different problems. And one of the things that happened in my job is that we quickly became aware of the fact that if we helped one of our young charges get a diagnosis of ADHD, it served as a real get out of jail free card for them. Not literally they got out of jail, although probably that happens sometimes. But more to the point that when we found them funding that was, for example, attached to them staying in school, if they had this ADHD diagnosis, it helped them if they ran into problems. It allowed them to stay on funding a bit longer. And I'll be completely upfront and honest, we took advantage of this. We made sure that anyone that had an inkling of an ADHD diagnosis got an ADHD diagnosis, simply because it helped them keep their funding and stay out of trouble. So I ended that job in 2001. One of the few jobs I've left in a fit of anger, but that's another story. And I started a master's degree in September 2001, an interesting time to be embarking upon an academic career, as you might imagine. But I didn't start looking at the history of ADHD at that point. I'd actually started out looking at the history of the Boyle lectures. So looking at the Royal Society and the relationship between science and religion. And perhaps it was partly the after effects of the job that I had. Perhaps it was partly to do with September 11th, 2001. But at some point I thought to myself, why am I doing this? Why am I learning about the Boyle lectures? I know that it's an important thing to learn about, but it just didn't feel like it was my thing to learn about. So at some point towards the end of that first semester, just about Christmas time, I went into my supervisor's office and said, could I do a history of ADHD? And she said, yes, because I think she was quite aware that I wasn't making much progress in my original topic. And that's really how I got started. So it was very much driven by a curiosity about, we were using this diagnosis, but what did this diagnosis actually mean? What were its origins, and why do we understand these kids in the way we do? Because very much in my job, we understood these children as products of their neurology, not their social environment. We didn't care about their social environment at all. All we cared about was the fact that they had that diagnosis, and that meant that something was wrong up here. And then they got drugs to fix it. So I became curious about that. And that eventually led to, I don't have an English language copy of the book, but I have the Japanese copy, Japanese translation, history, or Hyperactive, the history of ADHD, or controversial history of ADHD. So that's kind of how I got interested in this. So that's my personal context, and that will probably help to explain why I've taken on this topic, or these topics within the history of psychiatry and mental health, in the way I have. So now I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to, oops, I gotta do that first, hold on. Okay, the green button, there we go. Share, and I just gotta go up to here. Okay, so, whoops, let me just go back. Does everyone see Joanna's story? Okay, I got a nod from Laura, excellent, okay. So, Joanna is an interesting case study that, for me, typifies a lot of why we want to study the history of mental health and psychiatry, and why it's important. So as it says there, Joanna was a 28-year-old who was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Basingstoke many times during the late 1960s. She started to suffer from psychiatric symptoms after the birth of her third child, and these were very serious psychotic symptoms. She was a threat to herself, she was a threat to her children. Very serious situation indeed. And like many patients, psychiatric patients during this period, she had been through the ringer of psychiatric treatments, psychotherapy, all sorts of different drugs, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. None of these had been effective, and she was scheduled for a lobotomy, and which is a psychosurgical intervention that was, well, quite common during this period, but a very invasive and a procedure where you don't go back. You don't go back from it. So just before this lobotomy was performed, her psychiatrist, Dr. Richard McCarness, organized a final case conference for this patient. And McCarness was an interesting character. He had written, although he's a psychiatrist, he'd actually written some slimming books previously. So he was interested in food, and he had connections with American food allergists, particularly food allergists such as Arthur Koka and Albert Rowe in the United States. And McCarness suggested, rather out of the blue, that perhaps her psychiatric problems were something to do with her diet, something that she had ate. Now, as you might imagine, most of the people at this conference thought he was the one who was crazy. He was going to be next for some psychiatric treatments, perhaps. But the consultant in charge decided, okay, well, why don't we give this a try? An elimination diet, so a diet which restricted Joanna's diet to only a very few items of food, was introduced, and one by one different foods were introduced, and her behaviors were assessed afterwards. The response was remarkable improvement, almost back to her old self. She was able to go back to work. She was released from the hospital. She became a mother again to her children, and it was a real success story. So why do I start with this story? Well, for one, it highlights just how complex the history of psychiatry and mental illness, mental health is, and has been, and why it's such a fascinating topic. Now, here we have a young woman, and you just have to go through the points in the slide there, and you can count all the important themes that emerge. So, gender, being a mother, psychopharmacology, psychoanalysis, other sorts of invasive treatments, the role of food in health and mental health, and simply, the process by which a process such as a procedure such as a lobotomy actually was able to happen. So you get all these interesting aspects that can take you along into all sorts of different directions from just one specific story. Now, this story is from McCarness's book, Not All in the Mind, which is a book all about the role of food and mental illness. And the Not All in the Mind title, again, hints at this complexity, because what McCarness is saying in that title is that your physical, your mental problems are not all in your mind. They have something to do with what you're eating. But he's also playing on the idea that during this period, many physical problems were also thought to be in the mind. This is the era, really the height of psychosomatic medicine. And so he's also playing at that idea as well. So this is from his book, Not All in the Mind, published in the mid-1970s. And it's just a really interesting starting point to explore why this topic is so fascinating for me. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So the history of mental health is complex, and it's also fascinating. I'm showing these books. These are books from the Mental Health and Historical Perspective series, not to brag about how many books we've published, but just to highlight all the different themes and aspects that are important. One thing that comes out, one thing that we've been quite happy with, Kathy and I, in the series, is that it's quite an international series. So you've got Uganda, communist Europe, we've got colonial Bombay, we've got lots of other different places, Ireland, and within some of the edited volumes, many other countries are explored as well. And in order to understand the history of mental health in each of these countries, you need to know a bit about the context of each of these countries. So it's a complex thing to understand. And in something like Yelena Pringle's book on psychiatry and decolonialization in Uganda, you have the coming together of different medical traditions. So even more complex. So it's a complex topic. Now you could say that about a lot of different fields in medicine, but I think within psychiatry, partly because it's a field that is, I mean, Charles Rosenberg talked about how psychiatry of all the medical disciplines is probably the most imbued with the social. And because of that, it's something where you have all these different debates. And this comes up in the next slide I'll show here. So round about the time when Joanna was receiving her treatment, now the solution for her was a dietary change, but that wasn't the most common approach, obviously, in terms of psychiatry at this point in time. But we had three very different approaches that, you know, could not be more chalk and cheese when you think about it. And this is where I think the history of these different approaches becomes really interesting, because you have these debates, and from a historical perspective, we can kind of think, well, why couldn't they have gotten along a bit better? Surely it's a bit neurological, it's a bit social, it's a bit psychoanalytical. But then when you dig into the history and into the archives and the medical literature, you start to realize, well, there's many reasons why they didn't agree, and sometimes people with a very similar theoretical background didn't agree on things either. So just going through these three theoretical approaches. So at this time, mid-1960s, psychoanalysis, certainly in North America, and to a certain extent, most of the Western world, was still in the ascendancy. I mean, how many other medical disciplines has resulted in a comic book? Right? And it wasn't a long-running comic book, psychoanalysis, but it did probably 4 or 5 issues or something like that. But even still, I think the fact that someone commissioned a comic book series about a psychoanalyst is quite fascinating in itself. And the woman on the sofa there, apparently what she dreams about is a man in a kilt. So there's even a nice little Scottish connection for us there. And if you go through the pages, everything is a psychoanalytical trope. Everything has to do with the childhood, sexual things, and it's great fun. But, you know, it reflects the fact that psychoanalysis was important not only medically, but culturally. It had a huge impact on culture. You know, think about the shows like Frasier or The Sopranos. Psychoanalytical theories go right through those shows. It was also a time of social psychiatry, and this is why I've shown the map there. So that's a map from Ferris and Dunham's Mental Disorder in Urban Areas, which is here. And basically, it's the first project that really provides an epidemiological map of mental health problems, and this is looking at Chicago. So this is the first real serious attempt to link socioeconomic factors and mental health in social science research. And this is social psychiatry, which is something I'm researching right now, becomes really influential, leads to deinstitutionalization, so the closure of psychiatric asylums, leads to the community mental health movement, and also leads to all sorts of really interesting things. And I think in the midst of the pandemic, we're seeing a wee bit of a renaissance of social psychiatry, which I think is actually really good. And of course, the middle one there, this represents psychopharmacology or biological psychiatry. So this is an ad for Milltown, popular drug during the 1950s and 60s, and it's focusing on pregnant, expectant mothers. So pregnancy can be made a happier experience with drugs. Now, there's so much there. I can't really dig into it. We don't have the time, but you just think of, well, you could just go to town on this. And there's so many amazing, even today, there's so many amazing ads for drugs that say so much about psychiatry, about different ideas about what's underlying our mental health and how we should deal with it. So these are sort of the theories that are meant to be dominating thought about mental illness, and certainly there's a small amount of overlap but often they're in silos and they're competing with one another. But of course, we also get ideas contesting psychiatry from the outside as well. Some of these ideas are very good, I would say, to be blunt. Some of these others aren't so good. So here we have concepts such as neurodiversity. That's Temple Grandin with the cows at the top of the page there. So she's been diagnosed with autism, but argues that her autism has helped her in her career as a livestock expert. If she didn't have if she wasn't neurodivergent, she wouldn't have been as successful as she would. Going down below there, the hearing voices movement. So rather than simply dismissing the fact that people hear voices as a negative thing, trying to understand it in a more nuanced fashion. And then we also have, what I would say is probably less helpful ways of contesting psychiatry through the lens of Scientology, for example. And then, the image at the bottom, my bottom right, psychiatry and industry of death. Well, that probably takes it a bit too far and isn't nuanced enough to get really a meaningful discussion about mental health and why it's important. The final obligatory picture of Artie Lang in the middle, and then the other one is Asylum magazine. And this is really an attempt to understand mental health and psychiatry from lived experience of people. So Asylum is full of examples. It's been published since, I think, 1986, and it's a great resource, I think fully available on the Wellcome Trust library, which presents history of psychiatry and mental illness from below, a really valuable resource. So why does all this matter? Well, and some of these conclusions might come across as kind of banal and basic and self-evident, but I think it's worth uttering them anyways. So first of all, understandings of mental health have changed over time, and this is the important bit. They will continue to change, and this context is the main message there. Now, having said that, however, I don't think we can leave it at that, because I think it's clear that sometimes it's not a case of getting it all right and getting it all wrong, but I think at some points we've got it more wrong than other times, and other times we've got it more right than other times. And I think history has a role in articulating that and making that point. The other thing that's really important is that in the history, the historiography, I think we've very much had the voice of expertise being the medical voice, and the voice of people with lived experience really is only now starting to enter the discussion. And we need a much more of a balance in terms of those views. Simply because we know that mental illness and mental health is very complex, and that variety of experience helps us understand that. And that's why I put induction versus deduction. Deduction is knowledge derived from theory. And if I went back to that slide with psychoanalysis, biological psychiatry, and social psychiatry, that's what that was all about. It was this is how you solve mental illness, is from this theory, all answers will follow. Whereas induction, get back to Joanna. Here's a case of someone who apparently, I've never met her, but apparently was solved, her situation was solved by something completely left field. Mental illness is complex, but while most simple explanations are problematic, some aren't. And I think this is really important. It's something that's, I think, come to light in the pandemic. So we know that issues like abuse, poverty, inequality, social isolation, all these things are bad for mental illness. We don't need to research this much more. What we need to do is figure out what to do about these things. And this gets to my final point, which has to do with prevention. So much of the money that goes into mental health is on treatment. And many people will say that treatment has improved, it's saved many people's lives, it's made people's lives better, but it's not really as efficient as prevention is, isn't it? And for this, I go to Loch Katrine. So in 1859, the Loch Katrine waterworks were opened, bringing clear, fresh water from Loch Katrine, 45 miles or so outside of Glasgow, into Glasgow. And as a result, Glasgow's health improved. You didn't have to go down to the Clyde or buy water from a water salesperson. You could just get water out of the tap. And this, for me, is a great metaphor in a way for public health. You know, making an investment in something in order to improve public health down the line. And I wonder what the answer there is for mental illness. Getting back to poverty, inequality, and social isolation, I wonder if something like universal basic income could be a way of replicating that Loch Katrine pipeline for mental illness in the future. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. That was a really interesting talk, and we'll come back with some discussion after Hannah's presentation. But just to say to everyone who's tuning in, if you have any questions or comments from Matt, please log them now through the Q&A or the chat function, and we can come back to them in a few minutes. So we'll move on to Hannah now, and yeah, whenever you're ready, Hannah, we'll let you start your presentation.
Thanks, Laura. I'll just share my screen, and my slides are just kind of going to be playing in the background. Okay, so I'm going to be just sort of jumping straight in and talking quite specifically about the research project that I'm embarking on now, which is called Cold War Mentalities, Mental Health, Migration, Cultural Exchange, and the Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System. But thank you so much to Laura for organizing this. And I hope that some of this kind of quite specific material about my project will resonate with some of the broader issues that Matt raised in his paper. So, in a prison cell in Nuremberg in 1945, Hermann Goering, the second highest ranking Nazi on trial, expressed irritation at 3 small red spots on an ink blot shown to him by an American psychologist. The Rorschach ink blot test was developed by Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach in the early 1920s. He assumed that clues to the personality were revealed by how patients projected meaning onto the blots. And I'm showing some of these blots to you, so you feel free to project your own meaning onto them. By the 1940s, the test's use was so widespread in North America that it had become, according to John Exner, almost synonymous with clinical psychology. 21 Nazi detainees at Nuremberg were administered Rorschach tests, which joined records of tests conducted with 209 Danish Nazi collaborators. In the ensuing decades, the test responses continued to circulate among psychologists and were interpreted and reinterpreted, even though it turned out that many of the psychologists who actually administered the test had no real training in how to do it, and so the kind of significance of what they showed is obviously debatable. It was speculated that Goering's agitated emotional response to the colour red could be taken to indicate a dangerously volatile inner life. A large number of dahlias, daffodils, and roses were seen by Nazis in the ink blots, which some psychologists took to indicate an incapacity to relate to other people. But ultimately, psychologists couldn't really agree if high-ranking Nazis or Nazi collaborators had pathological conditions or were mentally just like any other person. Rudolf Hess, the former deputy Führer, who was among those who stood trial at Nuremberg, had been examined by psychoanalysts and psychologists since being taken prisoner in Britain in 1941. His family history and childhood were examined and peculiar eating habits observed. As with the ink blot tests, it was assumed that examining individual psychology could help explain mass psychology, but ultimately, no definitive diagnosis was given. A whole range of different things were suggested. In the USA, immediately after the Second World War, just to cite another example, The Authoritarian Personality, which was published in 1950, was a project concerned with identifying the potentially fascistic individual, which a group of social scientists, including the critical theorist Theodor Adorno, posited could be diagnosed by identifying underlying personality structures. Questionnaires designed to provide an insight into people's hidden feelings and dispositions were distributed to people from different social groups and organizations in the San Francisco Bay Area, who were paid $3 to participate. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, state authorities in the US and Britain were not only funding research into fascist mentalities, they were increasingly concerned to understand the communist mind, though these studies have received less attention from historians. So my project looks at one such project alongside a few others that are specifically about the Soviet Union, not communism more generally. In 1950, 5 years after Goering had got irritated by an ink blot in Nuremberg, Rorschach tests were carried out just 100 miles away in Munich by psychologists involved with the Harvard project on the Soviet social system. Rather than seeking to gain insights into Nazi psychologies, these social scientists were instead hoping to gain an understanding of communist mentality by conducting life history interviews and clinical trials with Soviet displaced persons living in internment camps in West Germany and Austria. So this is mostly people who'd fought in the war and then had remained in Germany afterwards. Their interviews were designed to expose the specificities of Soviet society and subjectivity, but the methodologies of the psychologists involved in the project were inspired by experiments conducted with fascists and proto-fascists. They used the exact same questionnaires devised by the Authoritarian Personality Project to explore what people admired, disliked, were saddened by, as well as using batteries of projective tests like the Rorschach. Commissioned by the US Air Force, as the Cold War was beginning to take shape as a battle of ideologies, the Harvard Project on the Soviet social system officially participated in the US state's attempt to understand and defeat the communist enemy. Henry Dix, who had been Rudolf Hess's psychoanalyst in Britain and who had published on National Socialist ideology, conducted interviews with Soviet displaced persons as part of a pilot study connected to the Harvard Project. His emphasis was on how people related to authority and on the internalization of guilt and aggression. He was a psychoanalyst, and his preliminary findings, published in 1950, followed the 1949 publication of a controversial and very strange book by another British psychoanalyst called John Rickman and the anthropologist Jeffrey Gora, called The People of Great Russia, which argued that the practice of swaddling babies in infancy was what accounted for a general propensity towards accepting rather than challenging authority among Russian people, which was, I think, unsurprisingly, a controversial thesis. The main Harvard Project clinical tests, which is what I'm kind of focusing on, were conducted by two women called Eugenia Hanfman and Helen Bayer, both of whom had been born in Russia, had fled to Germany in the aftermath of the October Revolution in 1917. They attended university and were trained as psychologists in Germany, and then they fled to the USA after Hitler came to power in 1933. And these kind of more longer term patterns of migration are also part of something that I'm interested in this project, because actually it was mostly Russian people rather than Americans who were actually conducting these interviews. The Harvard Project was one of many massive interdisciplinary social scientific projects conducted in the immediate post-war period, which were animated by what Rebecca Lemov has described as a shared urge towards totality. According to Lemov, such projects demonstrated a desire to gather and quantify almost every aspect of human experience, including seemingly uncountable qualitative phenomena. Quote, "More and more, the reach of empiricism extended from the solid observables of cultural materials to less solid artifacts of mental attitudes, to collect traces of subjectivity itself, to make an archive of the inner contents of the mind," end quote. Through analyses of tests developed to transform elusive and ephemeral experiences like dreams, fantasies, and fears into data, she explores how projects designed to gather information pertaining to the material elements of different cultural groups extended to include the most subjective aspects of human life, that which sits at the far edge of materiality, So I'm kind of interested in this in my project, because I think on the one hand, it's this project that's sort of funded by the forerunners to the CIA, and has this sort of, and that's sort of how it's been analysed by most historians. But actually what the kind of information that is being found out, a lot of it is to do with dreams and fantasies and things that maybe don't seem immediately of interest to a kind of intelligence gathering, or these kinds of authorities. So I'm kind of interested in that contradiction. While the main interviews conducted as part of the Harvard project, which were the ones conducted more by sociologists rather than psychologists, concerned the material conditions of life in the Soviet Union, so housing, work, family, etc. The clinical tests were attempting to analyse much less concrete phenomena such as dreams, fantasies, fears, and hopes. The psychologists described, for example, a political commissar who was haunted by dreams of black crows, and a young woman who believed that dreams of fish in clear water signified pregnancy. But was one person's dream of a black crow significant for analysing the experience of Stalinism as a whole? Hanfman and Bayer emphasised that experiences of trauma had characterised the lives of the Soviet people they interviewed, most of whom had lived through and been impacted by the collectivisation of agriculture that began in the late 1920s, the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s, as well as the war itself. But did their definition of trauma imply a universal human subject, or did they find that Soviet people responded to and narrated their traumatic experiences in a culturally specific manner? Did the lack of a psychological concept of trauma in the Soviet Union and exposure to discourses emphasizing collectivity over individuality lead Soviet people to experience their lives in a distinctive way, or were their responses consistent with people from different backgrounds who had experienced similar events? So this is a tension between assumptions about mental health being universal on the one hand, and the idea that cultures or nations are distinct on the other. My interest in this material is, on the one hand, in the psychologist's theoretical approach and conclusions, but on the other, on the many limitations and contradictions that characterize the project in practice, not just of their testing methods, but in terms of the sample of people they were basing their conclusions on, and the material conditions in which the interviews took place. The people being interviewed had been outside the Soviet Union for up to 9 years by the time the experiments were conducted. Many interviewees suspected the interviewers of being either FBI agents or Soviet spies, and were wary of sharing information. Questionnaires and methods quite similar to those being used by the Harvard project had been used to forcibly repatriate displaced persons back to the USSR. So many participants were suspicious of these methods, while others thought if they said what they imagined the interviewers wanted to hear, they might be able to obtain a US visa more easily. There was also evidence that quite a few people signed up multiple times under different names to obtain the small cash incentive that was given to participants. So just kind of making up different life stories just to get a bit of money. Though the psychologists involved with the tests hoped to focus on typical Soviet people, their sample was also far from representative of the Soviet population in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, or class, and they had their own assumptions about who counted as typical. Often in kind of almost funny ways. They have these quite stereotyped ideas about, you know, a tractor driver or this kind of thing. Men far outnumbered, women among the interviewees, members of the intelligentsia were disproportionately represented compared to workers or peasants. City dwellers outnumbered people from rural areas. The respondents were mostly belonged to a single generation, and people from the Western republics of the USSR outnumbered those from the East. So 93% were from Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus, and only a tiny number from Central Asia or the Caucasus. There were also concerns that the displaced persons being interviewed were more likely to express hostility towards the Soviet regime and communist ideas than people who had chosen to return, and even more likely to do so given that they assumed that they were making assumptions about the kind of agenda of the Americans institutions conducting the interviews. they would also equally have been circumspect about any kind of Nazi collaboration that might have taken place, which was the case, I think, for some displaced persons. While researching in California, I discovered that one student interviewer who was involved in the project went on to work for years, kind of attempting to discredit the project's methods. And so he spent years trying to gather evidence to prove how flawed and kind of terrible its methods had been. Though ironically, his method for doing so was also a questionnaire. And the way that he kind of went about making contacts with people was mostly through reliance on a Russian American community who were involved in kind of specific anti-communist organizations. So they would no doubt have had their own agendas and have kind of very quite specific contacts, perhaps. My own approach sees these kinds of limitations of the project as part of what makes it historically interesting. The project was designed to give insights into life in the Soviet Union and to what Soviet people were like, which it wasn't particularly well placed to deliver. But the materials not only reveal assumptions about Soviet people and communist ideology produced by American institutions at the dawn of the Cold War, but also provide glimpses into the experiences of displaced persons and into the often fraught encounters that took place in the interviews themselves, in which the Soviet people being interviewed often questioned or resisted the process. The interview rooms were not like laboratories where the psychologists could simply extract information from their specimens, but were sites of contestation and messy human interaction. Sometimes the interviewers attempted to get around these difficulties by plying people with cigarettes and vodka, but sometimes things didn't really go as anticipated, and it forced them to revise their own preconceived ideas about, you know, what was significant. And so I'm interested in discerning these kinds of clashes, which are evident in some of the clinical material, like interview transcripts or test responses, between abstract theoretical ideas about mental health and the more kind of concrete, granular human encounters that were involved in the production of those ideas. Okay, that's it.
Great, thanks so much, Hannah. Yeah, I was enjoying the ink blots, and I'm thinking kind of maybe we should have got everyone to type what they were seeing into the chat function, but that could have gone horribly wrong. Yeah, so we've actually had a couple of questions in the meantime, and if anyone has any specific questions for Hannah as well, please feel free to submit them as you're listening. So the first one we've had is from Paul Moran, and it's addressed to Matt, but I think it kind of could apply to both of you, really. So Paul asks, to what extent is current day research on mental health in improving, or is it improving on our understanding of what conditions actually are and moving away from simple labels and diagnoses as a last resort?
Should I give that a whirl? I don't, maybe it's improving from time to time, but I think for the most part, the vast majority of researchers, and probably to a lesser extent clinicians, but still probably a majority of clinicians are interested in the label. Now, some labels are more problematic than others. And equally, some labels are more acceptable than others. And we do have debates, you know, from time to time. So leading up to DSM-5, there were big debates about where do you draw the line between sadness and depression? So sadness being something that's not pathological, depression being something that is pathological. One is just in the realm of everyday life. The other is in the realm of psychiatric practice. So I think we're slowly, there's more contesting of those labels these days than there would have been 15 years ago. And I think there's definitely a lot more contesting them here in the UK and in other parts of Europe, for example, than there is in North America. But if you go on to PubMed, for example, you know, and you read something on ADHD, most of the articles will will conceptualize it as completely unproblematic.
Great, and we've also got a question for Hannah. So I'll just kind of go through them. So it's from Despo Kritsotaki.
Hi, Despo.
Despo mentions that no research has been conducted yet about the funding of Greek psychologists and psychiatrists by the CIA in Greece during the 1960s. So Despo's asking, do we know more about such funding in different countries?
The short answer to that is that I personally don't know, but I do have a feeling that there is a kind of interest in this kind of work in different contexts. And I know that in Greece there were some quite unpleasant psychiatric institutions, but yeah, I don't know much about that specific context. But yeah, I'd be interested to find out. But yeah, sorry, I don't have a more specific answer to that question.
No, that's great. And another question from Natasha Prager. So again, I think this applies to both of your talks. So Natasha says, you know, given that increasingly we are talking about mental health as something which matters to everyone, how do you think we can go about interrogating the history of this? Many of the histories you talked about spoke of insanity or madness, but how do we go about exploring the history of more general mental health concerns such as loneliness, anxiety, depression? Is there a history of mental health that is not about psychiatric illness, and might this reveal something about the preventionist aspect you spoke of? Matt, I think, talked about that.
Yeah, so Fred Cooper, who's got his PhD at Exeter University relatively recently, is doing work on the history of loneliness that's really interesting and important. It connects a bit to the work that Ali Haggett has done on mental health problems, if you want to say that rather than mental illness, recently as well. So there is starting to be more work on that sort of aspect. I think part of the problem is gets to the historiography, I guess, is that there are just so darn many tantalizing, salacious topics in the history of psychiatry that students and academics are just drawn to them like a moth to the flame. I had a dissertation student yesterday, I don't know, maybe they're out there, I won't mention them by name, but they wanted to, they wanted to do work on women and psychiatry, kind of turn of the century, and surgical interventions. Is it Isaac Baker Brown? Is that the one? I think, yeah. I mean, just completely invasive clitoridectomies and things like that. And you think, well, on the one hand, maybe certain people would not want to research that, but on the other hand, a lot of people would, because it's just so darn bizarre. People are drawn to the bizarre. Lobotomy, you know, all the histories that have been done on various drugs, I think, because they're just, it's tantalizing. It's really fascinating. It kind of gets to, it's almost as mad as madness, if you get my drift, you know. So I think there's that element too. So I think it would be good for people to tackle these other aspects. And I think actually by looking at individual people's experiences, those stories can compete in terms of being just as fascinating. Certainly the oral histories that I've done, some of the stories that I've heard just talking to normal people are absolutely compelling, and they shed a lot of light on some of these complexities that I'm talking about. But yeah, there's just so many fascinating things to look at that I think sometimes it's hard to be drawn to the things that aren't more extreme and salacious.
Yeah, I would just say on that, yeah, that maybe there's a kind of, there's the history of psychiatry does kind of come up against the history of emotions in certain ways, and that sometimes experiences get classified as pathological at some moments, and that the different ways of describing experiences or feelings, sometimes they're classified as something that you could diagnose, and at other times they're not. And so, and I do think that the kind of terms that are used to describe more everyday experiences are obviously also historically specific, and themselves have a kind of relationship to languages of psychiatry in quite complicated ways. So you might use terms quite colloquially, like depressed, to mean something that isn't really like a clinical definition of depression. And so I do think there's something also quite complicated about how you sort of disentangle these sort of different histories.
Yeah, and Hannah, just kind of related to that, we have a question from Emma Newland. She's asking how, did the researchers that you're studying come up with any overall conclusions on how to characterize the communist mind?
Well, the short answer is not really, or rather they did quite a few tests that were comparisons with Americans. And one thing that they were really obsessed with was that Soviet people were liars. But they were also aware that a lot of their findings were very specific to the circumstances that the people were in. And I think one of the other things that they got super tangled up in was a kind of conflict between whether people were Soviet and therefore somehow communist, or whether they were Russian or Ukrainian, or whether they had a national characteristic. And this was a moment when research into national characteristics was very dominant, and so they would come up with these kind of strange conclusions. So things that they found sort of that they liked about the people that they met, effectively they classified as Russian traits, and then things that they found more difficult, or they usually classified as Soviet traits. So there's also this kind of but how they kind of made that distinction is also a sort of strange one.
Yeah, great, thank you. So we have another question from Matt. Well, I wanted to ask about the Asylum magazine you mentioned. And I was curious about who was behind, or who is behind that magazine. But we have a question from Ian Smith that kind of relates to that. So Ian mentions that, the blood-splattered cover of Asylum magazine, he said it's not something he would find encouraging for a doctor-patient alliance. So his question is kind of about how do we integrate individual experiences of mental illness into a general understanding of mental health in a better way, without it being biased by strong feelings, and kind of trying to achieve a more collaborative means of doing that. So that's quite a big question, but if you have any thoughts on that, Matt.
Yeah, whoops, sorry. I'll hang up. I don't know if that was someone trying to call me with a question. So the covers haven't got much, not so much blood, but they're still pretty radical and hardcore, I would say, the covers. And hi, Ian, if this is Ian Smith that I know, so I presume it is. So I think one way of doing it is simply having more dialogue that isn't within the doctor-patient relationship mode, so to speak. So Dr. Chizomo Kalinga, who's a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral fellow at the University of Edinburgh, I did an interview with her for a podcast series that I do recently called History in Action, available on SoundCloud. And she talked about some sessions that she had organized for her research, where she's researching Malawi, and she was taking doctors who are trained in the Western tradition and putting them in the same room with people who are much more trained, or much more marinated in traditional traditions, and getting them simply to chat about things without the hierarchy that you get in a doctor-patient relationship, and in a facilitated way. I think, and she's said that that was really instructive and really helpful. So I think that's one way of doing it, is just having more fora where people with lived experiences and mental health professionals, not just psychiatrists, but all sorts of people working in mental health, can have discussions that are just free, open, respectful, but also honest. I think that's one way forward. And, you know, I mean, given what we're doing right now, I think there's more opportunities to do that these days than there would be in the past. But I think, you know, the point you're making about there has to be respectful. You know, I often find myself kind of in the middle of these debates, and I'm not a very confrontational person, and sometimes it is a bit awkward. But I think respect has to be the starting point. You know, everyone should be respected for their views. The views might not be right in some ways, but they at least have to be respected, and that they can say what they think, and that they're safe in saying that. Very good question, though.
Okay, and another one for both of you, but maybe Hannah, you might like to take this one first. How do we approach the history of specific conditions without imposing today's understandings of it on them?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's very interesting as a historian, because I've noticed actually in histories of the Soviet Union, for example, it's often the case that historians themselves become kind of almost like lay psychiatrists, and you know, kind of projecting their own psychological diagnoses onto, you know, Stalin or whoever. And that's also very interesting, but using, of course, their own, the very particular understandings of mental health of their own particular kind of culture and moment. I think what I've found quite interesting in terms of working with the kinds of clinical material that are available with this project is that you can actually see, even in however mediated the material that is available, that was written down is, there is definitely a difference between what was recorded in the kind of interviews and then what was then published as the kind of findings of the project. And so I do think that however limited the kind of documents are, that you can kind of see a difference between what people are saying about themselves and how that information is then interpreted and how meanings are imposed on it by professional psychiatrists. And so I think somehow in that kind of space of difference, there's something that maybe there's a kind of, maybe you're still imposing your own interpretation, but you can at least maybe access the words of the people experiencing things rather than the people then interpreting them.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Hannah. Matt, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Hannah summed that up very well, so no.
Okay, great. Yeah, and oh, I've got another couple of questions. So thanks everyone for sending your questions in. This is excellent. So someone has asked about universal basic income. Do you think we can have UBI under capitalism, and how can Psy workers concretely help increasing social conditions / preventive measures for people?
All right, I think that's for me. Well, I guess it depends on how you define capitalism, and if when you slowly slide into something that's a bit more has more socialist elements, is it still capitalism? I mean, ironically, I think UBI would be a great force for entrepreneurialism of all sorts of different kinds in society. So I think actually the serious answer is yes, you can. It's just a different type of capitalism. In terms of Psy workers, I really think, I did a talk last year for the Royal College of Psychiatrists on UBI and mental health. And I sent out feedback sheets, and the psychiatrists were brilliant at filling them out. And two things that they said: one, they would vote more for parties that would promote UBI, which was really good. But two, they would speak more to their patients about their financial issues. I thought that's great. You know, that it doesn't have to be everything, but little steps like that I think are really, really useful. I do think that, I don't know if anyone here works for Mental Health Foundation or Mind or any of the big mental health charities, but I think mental health charities in particular have to be a lot more assertive in saying, listen, if we're serious about dealing with mental health problems, we need to change progressively. We need to, it doesn't have to be UBI, but we have to think about ways to make society more egalitarian, eliminate poverty, reduce social exclusion. And once we do that, then maybe we can tackle the really hard things like ending or limiting endemic abuse of children, which is a huge factor in people's mental health later on in life. So like there's no one size fits all solution. UBI would just be one step, but I think it would provide an important foundation to allow us to deal with some of the thornier issues when it comes to psychiatric epidemiology. But I think, you know, just talk more about it to your colleagues and get the discussion going. That's the way to get, you know, light the fire, so to speak. Thanks for the question.
Great, thanks, Matt. So we're almost out of time. So I'm sorry to those of you whose questions haven't been answered, but please feel free to get in touch with us at the CSHHH, or you can follow Matt and Hannah on Twitter as well. So just kind of a final question to end the discussion for both of you. How do you think that historians of mental health can contribute to current debates around mental health and actually make a kind of positive impact?
Well, I think two things. One is simply being curious, and as one of the previous questions intimated, looking at some of the less fashionable, perhaps, or less sexy topics, looking at some of the more banal issues like loneliness, sadness, these sorts of things. I think that's one thing. And equally, tackling topics with the expectation that at some point, someone from the BBC will call you up and ask you to be on the radio to talk about it, and be prepared, you know, so we're prepared to articulate our insights on the history of mental health and psychiatry in a way that everyday audiences can understand. I think those two things are probably the most important for me.
Okay, and Hannah?
Yeah, I think I would agree, and that there's a kind of, I think for me there's something helpful in realizing the ways that we've understood human behavior and subjectivity, and the ways that we've treated it have been so historically contingent, and that I think does kind of keep open the possibility for sort of thinking of new ways of kind of approaching these questions. And I think I'm also interested specifically in the ways that things that we might take for granted are always also kind of political or ideological, and that looking at history can be a way of sort of denaturalizing the way that we think about the present in some way.
Great. Well, thank you both very much again for two really fascinating talks, and thanks to everyone who tuned in and for your great questions. So we'll be here again next week at 1 o'clock with Chi Huang and Kay Nias talking about well-being and histories of well-being. So do join us again next week, and thanks again, Matt and Hannah.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.